I have a problem. I'm not very good at lubing my Speedcubes. You'd think you'd get pretty good at it after 12 years of experience, but for me, that just hasn't been the case. Here are 3 cubes that I've used extensively as my main, lubing them a bunch of times along the way, and today, all 3 of them just feel awful to turn. You've probably experienced this if you've lubed your own cubes before. You set it up for the first time, it feels absolutely awesome, you use it for a few months, and eventually the lube starts to dry out a little bit, gets a little bit gunky, maybe you get some dirt inside, and the cube starts to slow down. You think, that's okay, I'll just add some more lube. The cube feels good for a bit, but it very quickly starts to slow down again. You add in some more lube, and the cube just starts to gunk up with all that lube, and it never feels the same again. That's exactly what's happened to most of my main 3x3s over the years, but these 3 right here are some of the worst, as you're about to see. So in this video, I want to do an experiment and see if I can bring these 3 cubes back from the dead, making them feel more or less like they did when they were new. And if that's possible, I think it'll make me a little less afraid of lubing my cubes in the future, because recently I've kind of just been relying on the factory lube more than anything, and obviously that isn't quite ideal. Plus, one of these 3 cubes is actually still a contender for my main. I bet you can guess which one, so I'd really love to try it out again with it actually set up properly, and maybe I'll start using it again. So to get started, I'm sure you've all thought of the obvious solution to having a bunch of gunky old lube clogging up your cubes, and that is to clean it. But that's easier said than done. In fact, I've actually cleaned all 3 of these cubes multiple times, but they still seem to get worse and worse every time. I think that means my approach to cleaning cubes in the past just hasn't been very good. So today, I'm going to try something new, and I'm going to walk through exactly how I do it on each of these 3 cubes. So I guess I should introduce the cubes real quick. Over here is an original Diane GuHong, my very first speed cube from 2014. This thing has all sorts of mystery silicone lubes inside of it, and now feels very slow and gummy. Next up is the original Valk 3, one of my longest running speed cubes starting around 2016. As you can see from the stickers, this cube has been through a lot. I've set it up countless times, and on the inside is probably one of my grossest, dirtiest cubes. And finally, this one might be a little surprising, the Moyu WeiLong WRM Maglev from 2021. I like this cube so much that I tried setting it up over and over again to get it perfect, but it just kept on going downhill, and now it's just unusably slow and annoying to turn. So I think I'll go through these 3 in chronological order, which works out great because the mechanisms get more and more complicated, and show you exactly what I do to try and bring these cubes back to life. So let's start out with the GuHong. This one is really easy to take apart, and that happens to be the first step. Now this one might be the least visibly bad out of all of them, in spite of the white pieces, but I can tell just from taking it apart that these pieces are absolutely covered with way too much lube. I mean, look at this. Pieces should not be sticking together like this on a non-magnetic cube. Now previously, my strategy for cleaning up a cube like this has just been to take some paper towel and very thoroughly wipe off all the major surfaces of every single piece. Maybe if there's some hard to reach spaces in there, I can clean them out like this. My theory is, this does a pretty good job getting most of the lube off the pieces, but the really bad gunky stuff that really slows down your cube, it doesn't really get off. Maybe it gets like stuck into the cracks or just sticks on the surface really well. That's my theory at least. To see if I'm right, I'm going to be cleaning these pieces better than I've ever cleaned a Rubik's Cube before. I might still wipe them all down to get the obvious lube off, but then I'm going to get a bucket of warm soapy water, dunk all the pieces inside, and scrub them down as much as I possibly can until they look brand new again. Now obviously the plastic does wear down a little bit as you use a cube, so you're never going to get it exactly back to how it was out of the box, but I think by scrubbing it down to get out all the possible dirt and old lube, we should be able to get it pretty darn close. Now because we're going to be submerging everything in water, there are a few precautions that we need to take. For one thing, we obviously don't want water to be left over inside of the pieces, so we're going to have to take everything completely apart so that we can let the pieces dry. On an old cube like this, that's very easy. The edges just come apart in 2 pieces, and the corners come apart in 3, like this. Now we also have to think about all the metal pieces in the core. We really want to make sure these are dry when we put the cube back together, so I'm just going to unscrew everything and clean the metal pieces separately from all the plastic ones. Alright, so here are all the plastic pieces completely disassembled for cleaning. This cube is so old that it also happens to have a bunch of little plastic bits that you guys definitely don't have to worry about. And here are all the screws, springs, and washers, which I'll wipe off separately. So the plan is to wipe off all the obvious lube, get some warm soapy water and a toothbrush to get the rest of the lube off and any dirt, then rinse everything off, let it dry, and then we'll come back here to reassemble it. And the cube is assembled. I did put some weight force silicone in the hardware to reduce spring noise. I haven't lubed the pieces yet, but let's go ahead and try it out. And that is pretty bad. I don't know what I was expecting from a 10-year-old Speedcube, but it's not great. I think this is a key point that I've never really thought about before, but lubing cubes used to be a lot more important than it is today. I mean, on a modern Speedcube, you can get away with a pretty minimal setup or even just the factory lube, whereas on an older cube, you could extract a lot more performance just by lubing the pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick with some cubicle weight 2, just the way I normally would. So I put a fair bit on the outer pieces like this and just spread that around, and then a little tiny bit in the tracks down there, and then we'll put it back together and break that in. I can't say it's improved a whole ton since I cleaned it, but it definitely has gotten rid of that annoying overlubed gummy feel and gotten more of that original plasticky crunchiness back to it. It also definitely feels faster without all the lube slowing it down. Of course, it is still a GuHong, so it's not going to perform amazing, but I definitely am getting more of that nostalgic original feel, which I guess was kind of the goal. So now it's time to move on to the Valk 3. I warned you at the beginning, this is probably the grossest cube of them all, and I'm kind of dreading to see what's inside of here. Okay, I'll explain what's going on with this core in a second, but this cube is kind of the exact opposite of the last one. It is totally dry on the inside, I can't feel any lube, but if you look closely, the pieces are totally disgusting, just covered in dirt. If anything, this might be the most difficult cube to revive, because once you build up enough dirt in your cube, that rapidly speeds up how fast the plastic is breaking down, and so no matter what, this cube is probably going to end up feeling kind of scratchy. But obviously there's still a ton of room for improvement, so we'll see what we can do. Now the pieces of this cube look a lot more similar to a modern Speedcube than the GuHong did. The edges still come apart in basically the same way. You pull them apart, but as you can see, we now have 3 pieces instead of just 2. Of course, there's no way to clean the pieces without having the magnets in there too. I don't think soapy water is going to do anything bad to the magnets. We just have to make sure that they're absolutely dry before putting the cube back together. Of course, the corners also have magnets that you have to pay attention to. On most cubes, these come apart very easily. You just pry them open like this. But if you happen to have an original Valk, they have this really annoying thing where they have a cap on the bottom, and then you have to disengage these little clips, and then take the stock of the corner off, and then pry everything else apart. But on most cubes, it'll be very easy to just pry it apart and get to the 4 pieces. And that brings us to the core. And as you can see, this isn't exactly the core that comes in the Valk 3. Looks more like a GAN core, doesn't it? This was a fun little mod that I tried back in the day, converting a Valk to use the GES tension system, but I ended up cutting the plastic a little bit too thin, and it ended up breaking in a bunch of places. So at this point, I think I might just cut my losses and try and convert it back to the original system. So here are all the broken down plastic pieces, which I'll clean the same way as before. Somehow the insides of these corners look even grosser than the outsides. I guess there's some holes in them, so a bunch of dirt got in. Also, since I magnetized this cube myself like 6 years ago, there are some problems with missing magnets that I'll have to fix. And then of course, we'll have to figure out something to do with the core. So let's get started. Alright, that was a lot of work. Not only were there a lot of pieces to clean, but I also ended up having to re-glue the magnets in about half of the pieces. You can also see that I'm back to using the original screws and springs, using a little plastic piece down there that I designed and 3D printed that basically just covers up the big hole that I made previously and makes it work just like the original center. And even though I'm not using them anymore, I also went ahead and cleaned out all those old GES nuts, which also took quite a while. Anyway, I'm very interested to try this one out because again, out of all of my main Speedcubes, this is probably the one that was the grossest that had degraded the most in performance. So let's do some first turns. And oh my gosh, that is not only so much better than before, but also such a nostalgic feeling. I mean, it definitely feels far from new. You can tell how much the pieces are worn down just from turning it. This is the definition of a broken in Speedcube. That terrible slow gummy feeling is almost completely gone. Obviously it's not quite as fast as it was out of the box, but it certainly is a lot better than it was before. And you can just feel that nice crisp clackiness of the original Valk that brings back so many memories. I am going to add some lube to the pieces, but only a tiny bit because 1, it doesn't need as much lube as the GuHong did, and 2, I kind of like it the way it is. So just getting that broken in. This obviously isn't the best Speedcube in the year 2023, but it has improved so much that I'm happy to call this experiment a big success. Alright, it's finally time to move on to the WeiLong WRM maglev, or whatever it's called. This for me is definitely the most interesting cube out of all of these. It was the most clear case for me that just wiping down the inside of a cube with a paper towel doesn't get rid of all that old gunky lube. And that's not helped by the fact that I obviously over-lubed this last time I tried to set it up and then proceeded not to break in the lube at all. So right now, the inside of this cube is kind of just a sticky mess. And it gets even worse because this cube is not easy to take apart any further than this. It has one of these newfangled stickerless designs where the plastic doesn't actually go all the way down to the cube, and these caps are not easy to get off. I like using these little plastic pry tools so that you don't accidentally scrape up the plastic. Basically, you just get it in there and then just pull upward. You might have to flip it around and do it on the other side as well. It takes an uncomfortable amount of force. It also seems to bend the plastic right there more than I'd like, but I guess this is the best way to do it. Fortunately though, on the edges, you can actually pop out these adjustable magnets, which means that we have all plastic on the inside and don't have to worry about the metal. Fortunately, the corners are a little bit easier. You just have to pry each part of it upward a little bit like this, and then it should come off very easily. The magnets are glued in here, so again, we have to be careful about not having those wet when we put it back together. But from here, the process should be pretty much the same as the last couple times. The core also looks much more like a modern speed cubing core. We basically just have to unscrew everything and then get rid of the screws, springs, or in the case of a maglev cube, the magnets. Okay, that was a bit of a pain, but we now have all the plastic parts disassembled. We also have all the metal and magnety stuff over here, which I don't think we need to wash at all. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, I find the maglev and the tensioning a little bit finicky on this cube just because it's so adjustable, but I think that's about how I like it, so let's try it out. Oh my gosh. I think that's as close as we're going to get to 100% back to original out of any of these three cubes. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it perfect. I might have to mess with the settings a little bit more, but this cube has instantly gone from unusably bad to probably top 3 main contender for me. All the old gummy lube is gone. It's back to being just about as fast as I like it. And I'm seriously going to have to set this up carefully to see if it can actually become my main again. So I guess one thing I've learned throughout this video is that newer cubes really don't need a lot of lube. I put probably a third as much in here as I did in the GuHong, and it already feels like plenty. And if you do put too much lube in, don't panic, you can always wipe it out and try again. But if you have a cube like this that you've solved and lubed countless times, it might just be time to take it apart and do a thorough cleaning. And also, if you account for the fact that these 3 cubes account for maybe 30% of the 3x3 solves that I have ever done, it's pretty amazing how much life you can get out of a $20 or $30 plastic puzzle. But needless to say, I'm very happy with the results of this little experiment. I well and truly brought these 3 cubes back to life, and I might even get a new main out of it. But I hope you all enjoyed the process, because that's pretty much it, and I'll see you guys next time.